As the first winter snow swept across Lancaster County, Lydia worked through the evening, stitching the last pieces of a quilt. Outside, the winds howled louder than the howling voices of doubt from the neighbors. Would it be enough to keep her family safe when the storms grew fierce? Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of humble strength and simple living resonate with you, join us tomorrow for another tale. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Lancaster County, sending a chill that wrapped around the small homes like the very hands of winter itself. Inside the Miller family cabin, the warmth of a crackling fire and the soft glow of oil lamps pushed back the cold that sought to claim the world outside. But for Lydia, it wasn't enough. Not this time. Lydia's hands worked tirelessly, stitching together the final pieces of a quilt she had been crafting for weeks. The thick fabric, filled with layers of warmth, was meant to shield her family from the coming storm. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, soft and quiet at first, like whispers from the sky. But Lydia knew better. She had seen enough winters to understand that this one would be different. She paused for a moment, lifting her eyes from the quilt to the window. The snow was picking up speed now, swirling in the wind, and she knew it would soon blanket the land, sealing the world in a frozen silence. The warmth inside her cabin would be a treasure, but she had also heard the rumors from the neighbors. They called her preparations excessive. Quilts, they said, were a luxury. Firewood, barrels of food, and thicker walls were what would save them. Lydia's husband Tobias entered the room, shaking the snow from his coat. He looked at the quilt spread across the table, then at the fire. His face was tired, worn from long hours at the forge, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. "The first snows come early this year," he said, pulling off his boots. "Will the quilt be ready?" Lydia smiled, gently running her hand over the quilt's smooth surface. "It will be. I've made sure of it." Her voice was calm, but underneath there was a quiet strength, a knowing. Tobias had always trusted her work, her hands, her wisdom in matters of warmth and survival. But the neighbors did not share that trust. They mocked her slow pace, claiming there was no need for so much preparation. They didn't understand. As Lydia continued her work, she could hear the neighbors' voices in her head, echoing the doubts they had planted. Why waste time with quilts when the winter will be mild? Why not finish faster and get the barn ready instead? But Lydia knew the truth. It was the quilt, the warmth that came from the careful, steady work of her hands, that would see them through. Not the hasty preparations of others, rushing to gather what they thought was enough. No, the warmth of the quilt, the patience it took to make was the real answer. Winter was unpredictable, and it was in the quiet, steadfast preparation that one could truly survive. As the first storm of the season rolled across the valley, Lydia's small cabin seemed like an island of peace in the midst of chaos. She and Tobias sat by the fire, their children huddled in the warmth of the quilts. The wind howled outside, bending the trees and sending the snow whirling in sharp, stinging gusts. But inside, the cabin was snug, filled with the comforting smell of wood smoke and the quiet crackling of the hearth. Yet Lydia could not forget the neighbors. Their hurried preparations had left her unsettled. She had seen their homes a few hastily stacked firewood, small piles of grain, and barrels left exposed to the cold. The women had scolded her for not focusing on the barn and the fields. "What use is a quilt when the animals will freeze?" they asked, laughing as if it were a joke. But Lydia wasn't laughing. As the storm raged on, she heard a knock at the door. Tobias rose to open it, and there stood Naomi, her face pale with cold, eyes wide with worry. Behind her, the silhouettes of her children, shivering in the biting wind, could be seen. I'm sorry to bother you," Naomi stammered, her voice thin with fear. "Our fire has gone out, and the wind is too strong to keep the warmth inside. Can we come in, just for a little while?" Lydia looked over at Tobias, who nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he said, his voice calm. He stepped aside to let Naomi and the children inside. Lydia, without a word, gathered up the quilts she had made, the ones that had been carefully crafted with love, and began to unfold them by the fire. As Naomi and her children sat by the hearth, Lydia noticed the desperate look in her eyes. Naomi's family had never prepared as Lydia had, rushing, thinking they could survive with just the basics. The quilts she had mocked in the past now seemed like a lifeline. Naomi wrapped her arms around her children, watching them warm slowly by the fire. "You were right," she whispered, so quietly Lydia could barely hear her. "We thought the winter would be like others. But this is different. I never thought we'd need quilts so badly." Lydia said nothing. She simply laid a quilt over Naomi's shoulders and handed her a bowl of soup. The warmth of the fire, the softness of the quilts, and the quiet understanding between the women spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't about being right. It wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about being prepared, about knowing that sometimes it's the things we do quietly, the things we put our heart into, that will carry us through the hardest times. As Naomi and her children slept soundly by the fire, Lydia couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. Not for being right, but for knowing that the warmth she had worked so hard to provide was more than just a quilt. It was a shield against the world outside, a testament to the power of patience, and above all, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can keep us alive. The storm, relentless in its fury, continued to howl through the night. Outside, the wind whipped the snow into blinding sheets, causing drifts to pile high against the walls of the cabin. Lydia stood at the window, gazing out into the whiteness, feeling the weight of the storm press against the very fabric of the world. Inside, the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room, but it wasn't just the flames that gave comfort. It was the quilts, her quilts carefully stitched with love and faith, providing a buffer against the cold that none of the rushing preparations outside could hope to match. Each stitch, each layer of fabric, had been made with the knowledge that the winter could be cruel, that it could test everything, and that preparation mattered more than pride. Lydia glanced over at Tobias, who sat in his chair, his eyes half closed in quiet thought. The children were already asleep, tucked under the thick quilts, their breaths steady and warm. The storm outside raged, but inside there was peace. The warmth was almost sacred, no drafts, no cold seeping through, no worries about firewood running out too soon. Lydia felt her chest tighten with gratitude. They were safe, and the quilts were a reminder of how faith and preparation could stand against even the harshest forces of nature. It wasn't like that for everyone. She thought of Naomi's family, their cabin, built hurriedly with barely enough warmth to make it through the night. Naomi had come for help just hours before, seeking refuge from the cold that she hadn't fully prepared for. Lydia had heard stories of neighbors whose homes were cold and dark, their firewood quickly burned through. The wind would find every crack, every gap in their rushed construction, and leave them shivering. But Lydia knew, even as she sat by her own hearth, that there was little she could do for them now except offer a quilt, offer warmth. She felt a pang of guilt for her neighbors, perhaps even a twinge of anger. Why hadn't they seen it? Why hadn't they understood that the cold could strike when least expected? The quilting, the preparations, it wasn't just about a family being warm. It was about ensuring that, when the storm came, they would survive it. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, drawing the quilt a little tighter around her shoulders. It was a quiet victory. She had done her best, and it would see her family through. The storm might rage on for days, might bury the world outside beneath piles of snow, but inside her home there was nothing but warmth. As the night wore on, Lydia sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside and the occasional soft snore of her children. The quilt was more than just a tool for warmth. It was a barrier, a shield built with patience, foresight, and love. She felt its strength, its weight, and the comfort of knowing they were safe. The storm may have taken the world outside, but inside her cabin, Lydia's work had ensured that her family would make it through. They would face the morning with warmth and hope, while others would struggle with the cold. The third night of the storm was the hardest. Snow piled high against the door, and the wind howled louder than ever, rattling the window panes and shaking the timbers of the cabin. Lydia had never seen such a fierce blizzard. It seemed as though the world outside was being swallowed by the storm, each gust of wind stronger than the last. But inside, her family was safe. Lydia rose quietly from the fire's warmth, checking the children once more, tucking the quilts tightly around them. Tobias, exhausted from days of work and worry, slept deeply, the peace of the cabin soothing him after the labor of the forge. The fire crackled gently, casting soft light across the room, and Lydia allowed herself a moment of stillness, a breath of relief. But that peace was soon broken. There came a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. No one else should be out in this storm. She quickly rushed to the door, peering through the crack in the wooden frame. It was Naomi. "Lydia, please, let me in!" Naomi's voice was frantic, barely audible over the storm. Lydia swung the door open, and Naomi stepped inside, her face pale, snowflakes still clinging to her shawl. Behind her were her children, faces red from the biting cold, their eyes wide with fear. Naomi collapsed into the room, her breath ragged. "The fire's gone out," she gasped. "We can't keep warm. The wind, there's no stopping it. I'm sorry to come here, but we—" Lydia didn't need to hear more. Without a word, she rushed to the hearth, throwing another log onto the fire, watching the flames leap and dance, eager to spread warmth. She turned back to Naomi, taking her by the hand. "Come, sit by the fire. I've made plenty of room. You and your children are welcome here." Naomi hesitated for just a moment, her eyes darting to her children. Then, with a heavy sigh, she let herself be led to the hearth. Lydia quickly wrapped one of her quilts around Naomi's shoulders and another around her children. They huddled together, grateful for the warmth, but their eyes betrayed the fear that had followed them in. "It's bad out there," Naomi whispered. "I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't think we'd ever need so much." Lydia nodded, understanding. She had heard the same doubts before, in Naomi's voice and in others. The quilts, her quilts, had been mocked, dismissed as an unnecessary luxury. But now, in the heat of the storm, those quilts were the difference between survival and despair. Naomi sank into the warmth, her body relaxing as the quilt settled over her. Lydia could feel her family's warmth spread into the room, slowly thawing the chill that had followed Naomi in. "Thank you," Naomi whispered again, her voice softer now, full of gratitude. "Thank you for your patience, for your foresight. I can see now." Lydia smiled gently. "It's no trouble. We're neighbors after all." But deep down, Lydia knew the lesson had been learned. Naomi had come seeking warmth, but she had also come seeking understanding. It wasn't about proving others wrong, it was about offering what was needed when the world outside was at its worst. And as Lydia sat down by the fire, watching Naomi's family begin to relax in the warmth, she knew that her quiet work, the careful stitching of every quilt, had made all the difference. The storm broke on the 4th morning, as suddenly as it had begun. The snow stopped falling, and the wind softened into a whisper, leaving behind a world blanketed in stillness. Lydia stepped outside, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. The sky was a pale, quiet gray, and the trees, heavy with snow, stood like silent sentinels. Her breath was visible in the cold air. But as she turned back toward the cabin, warmth filled her chest. Inside, Naomi and her children were still asleep by the fire, wrapped in the quilts that had kept them safe. Lydia closed the door behind her, the soft warmth of the room wrapping around her like a cloak. Naomi woke shortly after, her eyes wide but peaceful. The storm had passed, but she looked exhausted, the weight of the night's fear still lingering in her gaze. "Thank you again," Naomi said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Lydia smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "There's nothing to repay. We're neighbors. Neighbors help each other when times are hard." As they sat together, Naomi finally spoke the words Lydia had been waiting to hear. "I understand now. It's not about being right. It's about being ready. The quilts, they weren't just warmth, they were safety. I see that now." Lydia nodded, the quiet joy of understanding settling in her heart. It wasn't about the quilts. It was about the patience, the love, and the foresight to prepare for what might come, no matter how cold the world became. The fire burned steadily, and Lydia knew that this winter at least, her family had found warmth not just in their home, but in each other.